The next issue I want to discuss is consumer protection in the mortgage industry. And the problem there is that I think there are things that consumers do not know. Typically, consumers don't really know what they can afford. They don't know much about settlement fees, and settlement fees can change even between the time that you make a loan commitment and actual settlement. You can actually just show up at settlement and have unexpected charges in terms of settlement fees. They don't know the trade-off of upfront versus over time. So if somebody says, "I'll offer you, 3.5% interest, and you pay, 2 points up front," and somebody else says, "Well, I'm going to offer you 3.25% interest, and you'll pay 4 points up front," the consumer doesn't know how to make that comparison. And so, they get things like, it gets translated into things like APRs and so on, which don't necessarily make the comparison properly. So they don't know how to do that, and then they don't often are not aware of competitive offerings, and then when they do see a competitive offering from a different mortgage lender, their ability to compare that offering is confused by different combinations of points and interest rates, different settlement fees, and so on. So basically we have consumers getting involved in a very complex transaction that's a very big transaction. It's a huge debt, and there are many instances in which consumers end up paying higher rates than they need to, in particular often because they make bad choices on the points versus over time, or they don't pick the right competitive offering. So what can you do about that? I mean, the answer that's been tried over and over again is disclosure, better disclosure, or certain rules about things. I just don't think it works. One idea I've thought of I call principles-based regulation. This is not something that's original with me, but something that I think is the most plausible approach, which is that you tell lenders that it is their job not to rip off the consumer, that they've got to offer the consumer a fair deal, a deal that you would take if you were in that consumer's shoes. So that might be the principle, a deal you would take in that consumer's shoes. Okay, for people who are precise and legalistic in their thinking, they say, well, how can you measure that? And I think what I would be doing if I were trying to enforce principle-based regulation is I would be auditing the process at the lender. So, what are the incentives that they give to loan officers? In the industry now, very recently there was something called a yield spread premium, which is basically an incentive to loan officer, that the loan officer would get a lot more money if they ripped off the consumer than if they gave the consumer a fair deal. So if you see those incentives operating, you know that they're not consistent with principles-based regulation. You can audit the training. How are people, how are loan officers trained? Are they trained again to deceive, or are they trained not to? You can look at the policies for setting rates and fees. the policies for disclosing them. You can look at disclosure policies. So the idea is you can audit them, and then you can also look at the you can look at some outcomes. Are the weakest borrowers getting the worst deals? By weakest, I mean people who are least informed, and with low income. So if borrowers who are relatively less informed and have low incomes are getting worse deals, that that is, it's not just the highest rates, but higher rates relative to what they could get in the market, keeping in mind that people who are on low incomes might have higher risks, and so they're going to face some higher rates for that reason. But sort of if they're getting bad deals that are sort of over and above appropriate risk-based pricing, then that would be a sign that that the company is not engaging in sort of is not following the principle of giving people deals that they would give to themselves under similar circumstances. So I think again the main thing to audit for principles-based regulation is process, but you could also look at outcomes. But the bottom line is that consumer protection is a tough issue in the mortgage industry. There are a lot of ways to extract excess profits from a consumer who is just, there's almost no way that you can arm the consumer with enough information to protect themselves against losing, hundreds or thousands of dollars that they don't have to lose in this large, complex transaction. So I think consumer protection is a challenge. My suggestion, and I know that there are some pretty obvious challenges with it, is to use principles-based regulation.